90 million Americans. That is the number that operational forecasters are converging on today, and it is not describing a tornado outbreak or a hurricane landfall. It is describing the population sitting inside a severe weather corridor that stretches from west-central Texas through the Ohio Valley and the lower Great Lakes and into northern New York and the state of Vermont. At the same time, a separate 90 million, with substantial overlap, are sitting inside a mid-Atlantic heat dome with 850 millibar temperatures running 2 to 3 standard deviations above climatology, producing record-tier highs in mid to upper 90s along Interstate 95 from Washington through Boston. One single Rossby wave is producing both at the same time, and what comes after this event in the 48 hours that follow is a 25 to 30 degree temperature crash that nobody is yet talking about. If this is what one wave can do on May 19th, the question we need to answer is what comes next. If today is the calibration, what is the atmosphere actually calibrated for? If this has you hooked, the way it has me, do me a favour and hit that subscribe button so we can keep tracking this together. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from, whether you're inside the heat dome, the severe corridor, or the central United States flood zone, and what the air outside your window looks like right now. Welcome to the Sky Lab. Let's get into it. Part 1. The day. The atmosphere stacked up. There are days when the National Weather Service issues a few alerts, and there are days when the entire ledger of operational weather in the United States seems to align in one direction. Today is the second kind of day, and the scale of what is happening is hard to convey through a single number on a map. As you're watching this, 90 million Americans are inside a severe weather corridor that stretches from west-central Texas through the Ohio Valley and the lower Great Lakes and into northern New York and the state of Vermont. At the same time, a separate 90 million Americans, with substantial overlap, are inside a heat dome that is producing record or near-record temperatures along the entire Interstate 95 corridor from central Virginia through Philadelphia and New York and into Boston. The atmosphere is doing two enormous things on the same day, in the same week of May, on the same continent, and it is doing them with the same wave. The number that you keep hearing today is 90 million, and it is the number that the National Weather Service forecast offices and the Storm Prediction Center and the broadcast meteorologists are converging on, because it is the cleanest way to describe a corridor of risk that does not respect the boundary between weather categories. The Storm Prediction Center has a slight risk severe weather outlook today that runs from west-central Texas through the Ozarks and the Tennessee Valley and the Ohio Valley and the lower Great Lakes and curves north into western New York and Vermont. It is one of the largest single-day severe weather footprints the agency has issued in mid-May in recent years, and inside that footprint are population centers that include Dallas-Fort Worth, Cincinnati, Indianapolis, Columbus, Cleveland, Detroit, Toledo, Buffalo, and the cities of upstate New York and northern New England. Inside the heat dome footprint that overlaps it are New York City and northeast New Jersey and Philadelphia and Baltimore and Washington and the entire central Virginia Piedmont and the Connecticut and Merrimack valleys of southern New England. The combined footprint covers roughly half of the population of the United States. What makes today different from a standard severe weather day, or a standard early season heat day, is that today is both at the same time, and the atmosphere is producing both of those things from one upper level pattern. There is a deep upper trough sitting over the western United States, and there is a strong upper level ridge anchored just off the southeast coast, and the two of them together form a single Rossby wave configuration that is doing all of the work. The trough is producing the western half of the story, which includes the trigger for today's severe weather as a cold front sags into the warm sector. The ridge is producing the eastern half of the story, which is the heat dome, and the wave between them is producing the energy gradient that drives the whole thing forward. This is not a normal mid-May setup. This is the operational maximum of what a single Rossby wave can produce on a single calendar day, on a single continent at this position on the calendar. To understand how unusual that is, you have to look at the magnitudes that the National Weather Service forecast offices are using to describe what they are seeing. The Boston office, in the area forecast discussion issued just after 1:30 in the afternoon Eastern Time, places 850 millibar temperatures over southern New England in the range of 18 to 20 degrees Celsius. That number, for the people in the audience who are not meteorologists, is the temperature about a mile above the surface, and it is the variable that operational forecasters watch when they want to know how hot a column of air can get when you mix it down to the ground. In the climate record that the National Centres for Environmental Information maintains, the Climate Forecast System Reanalysis that runs from 1979 to the present, the 850 millibar temperature on this calendar position over southern New England in mid-May should be running about 8 or 9 degrees Celsius in a typical year. Today it is running at twice that. The Boston office calls the departure 2 to 3 standard deviations above climatology. A 2 standard deviation event occurs about 5% of the time at any given calendar position. A 3 standard deviation event occurs about 0.3% of the time. For the May 19th calendar position, where the empirical baseline runs 47 years back to 1979, a 3 standard deviation event would be expected to occur about once every 300 years at any single station. And what the Boston office is describing today is not a single station. It is a coordinated 2 to 3 sigma signal across multiple stations, across a multi-state region at the same time. The Baltimore-Washington office, in its forecast discussion issued just before 10 in the morning, describes another day of challenging record-high temperatures given the strengthened upper-level ridge. The 850 millibar temperatures over the mid-Atlantic, the office writes, will run in the range of 19 to 23 degrees Celsius. That is even hotter than what the Boston office is seeing. The office forecasts highs between 96 and 98 degrees Fahrenheit across the immediate I-95 metros and into the central Virginia Piedmont. The Mount Holly, New Jersey office, which covers the Philadelphia metropolitan area, calls the day record-setting early season heat. The New York City office, located in Upton on Long Island, has issued its first heat advisory of the year for northeast New Jersey and the New York City metro, valid from 11 in the morning today until 8 in the evening on Wednesday. The advisory describes today as the first high heat index event of the year for that population, which is the operational phrasing the forecaster uses to flag that the human physiology variable, the part that depends on whether your body has acclimated to summer heat yet, has become the controlling factor in the advisory, not the meteorological variable. The first high heat index event of the year for the largest metropolitan area in the United States is happening on May 19th. That is a calendar position anomaly all by itself. Mid-May is not when the New York Metro typically sees its first heat advisory of the season. The historical record places that first advisory typically in mid to late June. The advisory falling more than a month early, combined with the fact that the heat is climbing into the mid to upper 90s rather than the more typical low 90s of a first-of-season event, is the part of the data that turns this from an interesting weather day into an operationally rare one. So that is the heat side of the wave. That is the eastern half of what is happening. Now let me show you what the same wave is doing on the western half, because the severe corridor and the heat dome are not two separate weather stories with a coincidence between them. They are the two faces of the same upper-level pattern, manifesting through the same physics, on the same day, because that is what a high-amplitude Rossby wave does when its phase position lines up exactly the way it has lined up today. If you draw a single line across a forecast map from Galveston to Maine, you cross every category of operational weather the National Weather Service issues. You cross flood warnings on the lower Mississippi and across central Missouri and into Indiana. You cross the severe weather corridor across the Ohio Valley and into upstate New York. You cross the heat advisory belt along Interstate 95. You cross marine warnings along the New England coast. You cross small craft advisories on Long Island Sound. You cross the Wednesday cold front trough that is the next variable in the story. One line, one continent, every category. That is what today looks like operationally. And the thing you have to understand about today, the thing that the rest of this video is going to spend the next 90 minutes building toward, is that this is the climax of an operational sequence that has been visible in the forecast models for the better part of a week. This is not a surprise event for the operational community. The Storm Prediction Center identified the threat pattern several days ago. The National Weather Service forecast offices in the Mid-Atlantic and New England have been escalating their heat advisory language for 48 hours. The forecaster discussions in places like Mount Holly and Baltimore, Washington and Boston have all been pointing at today and tomorrow as the verification day for a pattern that began organizing itself last week. The operational community knows what today is. They have been watching it build. What is about to happen, and what I want to walk you through across the rest of this video, is the part that comes after today. Because the same wave that is producing today is going to do something on Thursday and Friday that operational forecasters are also watching very carefully, and it is not what most people watching this will be expecting. The atmosphere stacks up today. Then, on Wednesday, the cold front passes through, and within 48 hours after that, temperatures along the entire eastern seaboard fall by 25 to 30 degrees Fahrenheit. The heat dome that produces today's record numbers does not gradually weaken across a week of warm but not record days. It collapses across 2 days. And what comes after that collapse is the part of the story that nobody is talking about yet, and it is the part of the story that the operational forecasters describe with a phrase that I want you to remember as we work through the rest of this video. The phrase is not very favourable for organised severe weather. Operational forecasters are telling each other, in the technical discussions you can read on the public NWS website right now, that the synoptic environment between the Wednesday cold front passage and the next significant organised severe weather window is not very favourable. The next significant organised severe weather window in the operational forecast is approximately May 25th through May 28th. That is roughly a week of synoptic-scale silence after a 48-hour multi-hazard pulse. And that gap, that quiet, is the second half of the story we are telling today. Today is the maximum, the next week is the silence. And the question the silence is asking is the question that this entire video is built around. If a single Rossby wave can produce today, on May 19th, in a year when the El Niño Southern Oscillation Index is still officially neutral and only just beginning to lean toward El Niño, what is the same Rossby wave configuration capable of producing in October, or in December, or in the months that follow, when the climate state is more energetic and the equator to pole temperature gradient has shifted further? Today is a calibration. Today is the atmosphere telling you what it can do at the May 19th, 2026 position. The question that follows is what it can do at later positions on the same calendar, in the same year, with a different forcing state, and that is the question I want you to keep in the back of your mind as we work through the data of what is actually happening today. Let me show you what 90 million people are about to spend a Tuesday evening living through. Part 2. What 96 degrees in mid-May actually means. To understand why this matters, you have to spend a few minutes with the number itself, because the number 96 degrees Fahrenheit means something different in May than it means in August, and the operational forecast officers know this, and they are writing it into their discussions, and the rest of this video is going to use their framing, because their framing is the right one. 96 degrees Fahrenheit on August 15th in Washington, D.C. is a hot day, and the National Weather Service will probably issue a heat advisory for the urban corridor if the dew point is high enough to push the heat index past 105. 96 degrees Fahrenheit on May 19th in Washington, D.C. is a different event entirely. The difference is not the meteorological variable. The temperature reading is the same. The difference is the human physiology variable, your body, the cooling system that sits between your skin and your core temperature, and that depends on sweat production and blood vessel dilation to dump heat, is not acclimated to 96 degrees in May. It is acclimated to whatever the recent average has been, which in this case is more like the mid-70s. When you ask a population that has been living in mid-70s weather for the past 3 weeks to suddenly cope with mid to upper 90s, the cooling system that should engage cannot engage at full efficiency because it has not been calibrated. The sweat rate response is lower. The vasodilation response is slower. The threshold at which the body switches from feeling uncomfortably warm to being in genuine heat stress is lower, and the consequence is that 96 degrees in mid-May is medically more dangerous per degree than 96 degrees in mid-August. This is not my framing. This is the framing the New York office is using right now. Read the area forecast discussion from the New York office issued at 10:37 this morning Eastern Time. The first paragraph under Key Message 1 identifies offshore high pressure and increasing low-level southwesterly warm air advection as the mechanism. The second paragraph names the heat advisory for northeast New Jersey and the NYC Metro from 11 this morning to 8 tomorrow evening. The next sentence reads, and I'm quoting the forecaster, "This is the first high heat index event of the year for northeast New Jersey and New York City." That sentence is doing a lot of work. It is operationally an admission that the public health risk profile of today's event is elevated relative to a comparable temperature in a fully acclimated population. The forecaster is choosing to issue the advisory not because the heat index is going to break some absolute threshold, but because the population is not ready for this much heat, this fast, this early in the season. The Mount Holly office does the same thing in its discussion when it writes that this stretch of early season heat, with record-breaking high temperatures probable, will have potentially greater impacts. The phrase potentially greater impacts is the operational phrase forecasters reach for when they are signalling that the public health variable, the part that depends on the population not being ready, has overtaken the meteorological variable as the controlling consideration in their advisory. So let me show you what the numbers actually look like across the eastern seaboard today, in the order the air is moving across it. Down in central Virginia, the Baltimore-Washington office is forecasting highs in the central Virginia Piedmont and the immediate I-95 metros between 96 and 98 degrees. The 850 millibar temperature over the area runs at plus 19 to plus 23 Celsius, which translates through the dry adiabatic lapse rate, the rate at which the atmosphere cools as a parcel of air rises, into a surface potential temperature that is comfortably in the high 90s when you mix the boundary layer all the way down to the ground. The afternoon dew point runs in the upper 50s and lower 60s, which is dry enough that the heat index does not run much above the actual air temperature, but uncomfortable enough that being outdoors for any extended period becomes physically taxing. The forecaster describes the day as another day of challenging record high temperatures and the operational record at Reagan National Airport for May 19th. The daily high temperature record for the calendar date is in the same range as what is forecast today. The forecast and the record are operationally indistinguishable, which is the language that means the record either gets tied or broken depending on the timing of the warmest hour of the afternoon and the cloud cover above it. Moving north into the Philadelphia metropolitan area, the Mount Holly office forecasts temperatures peaking in the 90s for many areas today and Wednesday, except cooler along the coasts and the higher terrain. The heat advisory is in place across much of the region, including most of the area where the heat index criteria starts at 100 Fahrenheit. The urban I-95 corridor criteria, the office notes, starts at 96 Fahrenheit through June, which is the lower threshold the office uses because the urban heat island and the population density combine to lower the operational threshold for issuing a heat advisory in the I-95 metros. The peak heat indices today, the office writes, will be 95 to nearing 100 degrees, with the core of the heat shifting a bit more south and east during Wednesday. The portions of the heat advisory for areas farther north and west of I-95, the office writes, only goes through Tuesday, because the cooler northerly flow behind the front arrives earlier in those areas. Temperatures at night, the office writes, will be quite warm by mid-May standards. Lows will only be in the mid-60s to low 70s, which will challenge daily warmest low temperature records for May 19th. Read that last sentence again. The daily warmest low temperature record, not the daily high temperature record, which is the one most people think of when they think of weather records being broken. The daily warmest low temperature record is the record for the highest minimum temperature observed during a calendar day. It is the record that measures how warm the overnight period stayed, and it is the more medically dangerous variable in any heat event because the human body recovers from heat stress at night, in a cool room, or at least a cooler outdoor environment, and when the overnight low does not drop into the low 60s or 50s, the recovery does not happen. The next day's heat stress accumulates on top of yesterday's, and the population that is most at risk, which is the elderly, the very young, the cardiovascular compromised, the renal compromised, and the homeless, is the population that has the hardest time recovering from sequential days without nighttime cooling. The warmest low temperature record is the death count variable in a heat event, and today and tomorrow are challenging the warmest low records across the I-95 corridor for the May 19th and 20th calendar positions. Moving farther north into New York City, the office forecast for the NYC Metro and Northeast New Jersey is mid to upper 90s today, with slightly cooler high temperatures and heat indices for Brooklyn and Queens. The dew points are mostly in the low 60s today. The cold front that arrives Wednesday afternoon brings dew points up into the low to mid 60s as moisture advects in ahead of the boundary, and the highs, Wednesday for the NYC Metro, will be mostly in the lower 90s with corresponding heat indices in the mid-90s. The slightly cooler temperatures Wednesday are a function of the increasing cloud cover ahead of the cold front, but the heat indices stay elevated because the dew point goes up. Up in southern New England, the Boston office describes the same configuration with slightly different geography. The heat advisory remains in effect for much of southern New England on Tuesday and Wednesday. not necessarily because of the expectation for an exceptionally oppressive heat-humidity combo, the office writes, but due to a very early arrival of well above normal heat for mid-May in southern New England. The 850 millibar temperatures, as I mentioned earlier, run in the 18 to 20 Celsius range, which is 2 to 3 standard deviations above climatology. The warmest locations are the Connecticut and Merrimack valleys, where downslope flow will help push temps into the mid-90s with low to mid-90s elsewhere. The exception is along the south coast, where southwesterly wind trajectory off the ocean keeps the air mass at the surface much cooler. The ocean water temperature off the southern Massachusetts coast is still in the upper 50s to low 60s in mid-May, and that water mass acts as a thermostat on any south coast town that is in the path of the onshore flow. Across the entire I-95 corridor, the combined population inside the heat advisory belt, or the equivalent heat warning belt, is approximately 25 to 30 million people, depending on where you draw the western boundary. Inside that footprint sits New York City, with a metropolitan population of about 19 million. It sits Philadelphia, with about 6 million. It sits Boston, with about 4.5. It sits Baltimore and Washington, with a combined metro population of about 10 million. It sits the Connecticut and Merrimack valleys, with another 2 million. And it sits the central Virginia Piedmont, with another 4. That is the population centre of the eastern United States, simultaneously inside a heat advisory belt in mid-May, on the day the operational forecasters are describing as record-setting early season heat. The infrastructure of the population centre, the electrical grid, the water supply, the public health system, the transit system, the workforce, is the infrastructure that is going to be tested today and tomorrow. The grid is the first stress variable. When the air conditioning load ramps from a typical mid-May daily demand profile to a profile that looks like late July, the regional transmission operators have to find capacity that was not in the day-ahead market projections. The PJM interconnection, which is the regional transmission operator that covers most of the I-95 corridor from northern New Jersey south through Maryland and into Virginia, runs its day-ahead capacity model on temperature forecasts that come out of the National Weather Service and the National Centers for Environmental Prediction. When the temperature forecasts spike to record territory 36 hours in advance, the day-ahead market has to find generation capacity that is not in the typical mid-May fuel mix. The result is that natural gas peaking plants get called up, the spot prices in the wholesale electricity market rise sharply, and the demand response programs that pay industrial and commercial users to reduce load during high-demand periods get activated. None of that translates into a blackout under normal circumstances. The grid is designed to handle high-demand days, but the cumulative stress on the system, the wear and tear on the peaking plants, the higher fuel costs that eventually pass through to consumer bills, and the increased risk of an unexpected outage at one of the major generation facilities all add up. The water supply is the second stress variable. When millions of people simultaneously increase their water consumption for cooling, showering, and lawn watering, the water utilities have to push more volume through their distribution systems, and the older systems, particularly in the older cities like Boston and Philadelphia and Baltimore, were not designed for the peak summer load profile of a fully air-conditioned modern population. The result is that water pressure drops in some neighbourhoods, particularly the higher elevation neighbourhoods, and the older water mains experience accelerated stress that occasionally leads to a main break. The public health system is the third stress variable, and it is the one with the highest direct human cost. The emergency room admissions for heat-related illness rise sharply during a heat event in an unacclimated population. The cardiac and renal cases that are already at the edge of compensation in the at-risk population tip over into acute decompensation more readily under heat stress. The homeless population, the population without reliable access to air-conditioned shelter, the elderly population living alone in older apartment buildings without central air are the population that shows up in the cause of death statistics for a heat event. The medical literature is clear on this. The studies that have looked at the public health impact of an early season heat event in an unacclimated population, comparing it to a midsummer event at the same temperature, consistently find that the early season event produces a higher per degree mortality rate. The mechanism is exactly the acclimation gap I described at the start of this part. Today, in the I-95 corridor, that gap is exactly what is being measured. And tomorrow, when the heat continues, the gap widens further, because the population that did not adequately cope with today's heat is the population that goes into tomorrow's heat already partially depleted. The 2-day heat advisory window, the 11 a.m. Tuesday to 8 p.m. Wednesday window the New York City office issued, is doing exactly the work it was designed to do, which is to compress 2 operational days into one continuous advisory, because the public health risk does not reset to 0 at midnight when the heat does not relent overnight. So that is the eastern half of the story. That is what is happening to 90 million people across the heat dome footprint today and tomorrow. Now let me show you the other half of the wave, because what is happening on the western and central half of the continent today is just as operationally significant, and the same physics is driving both. Part 3. The severe corridor from Texas to Vermont. If you were to ask the Storm Prediction Center in Norman, Oklahoma, the office that issues the official convective outlooks for the United States, to describe today in one sentence, the sentence they would give you is something like this. There is a slight risk of severe thunderstorms today over a substantial portion of the country from west-central Texas into the lower Mississippi Valley and the mid-south, then up through the Ohio Valley and the lower Great Lakes and into western and central New York. That sentence does not communicate the geographic scale of what is being described, so let me translate it for you. The slight risk corridor today covers about 1.5 million square kilometers. It includes Dallas, Fort Worth and Houston on its southern end, every metropolitan area in the Tennessee and Ohio valleys including Memphis, Nashville, Louisville, Cincinnati, Indianapolis, Columbus and Cleveland, the entire industrial corridor from Detroit through Toledo to Buffalo, and the cities of upstate New York and Vermont on its northern end. Inside that footprint sit roughly 90 million Americans. The slight risk is the second lowest category on the 5-tier Storm Prediction Center scale, but the size of today's risk area is what makes it operationally significant. A slight risk that covers Dallas to Vermont is not a quiet day. It is the kind of geographic footprint that the agency uses when the synoptic environment is not focused into a single high-risk corridor, but is instead broadly supportive of damaging weather across a wide area. The primary threat today across the Ohio Valley and lower Great Lakes leg of the corridor is damaging wind, with the operational forecast calling for gusts of 45 to 65 miles per hour in the typical cell and isolated gusts of 70 to 75 in the most intense cells. The west-central Texas leg of the corridor is a different story and a different physics. Down there, the threat is hail, and the hail size is not in the dime to quarter range that you see in a typical Texas spring afternoon. The threat is for discrete supercell storms producing baseball-sized hail along the sagging cold front. Baseball-sized hail is 2 3/4 inches in diameter, give or take, and it is the size of hail that destroys vehicles, breaks windows in numbers, and routinely injures anyone caught outside without shelter. The west-central Texas risk area centers on a corridor from west of Abilene through the western side of the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex and south along the Interstate 35 corridor toward Waco. The synoptic environment supporting the hail signature is a textbook discrete supercell setup. A cold front is sagging slowly southeastward across the southern plains. Ahead of the front, the surface dew points are running in the mid to upper 60s as Gulf moisture pumps northward. Above the surface, the mid-level temperatures are cold, which translates into steep mid-level lapse rates, which translates into atmospheric instability when the surface heats during the afternoon. Mixed-layer convective available potential energy values are forecast to reach 1,500 to 2,000 joules per kilogram, which is enough instability to produce updrafts that can support the suspended hail growth required for baseball size. The wind shear environment, the variation of wind speed and direction with height, is in the 35 to 45 knot effective bulk shear range across the instability axis. That is enough shear for supercell storm modes, which means individual storms that rotate and can support sustained updrafts for extended periods. Discrete supercells in a 35 to 45 knot shear environment, with 2,000 joules of instability and Gulf moisture dew points in the upper 60s, are exactly the storm type that produces giant hail. The timing of the west-central Texas storms is roughly mid to late afternoon, beginning around 3 to 5 in the afternoon Central Daylight Time, as the cap on the boundary layer breaks and the first updrafts ascend through the lifting condensation level into the unstable mid-troposphere. The cells will initiate as discrete cells, separated from each other by tens of miles, each one capable of producing its own hail signature. As the cells mature and ascend through the late afternoon, the strongest of them will reach the level at which they can sustain hail growth in the upper third of the storm column. The hail forms at altitudes of 7 to 9 kilometers above ground level in the supercooled water layer of the storm, cycles through repeated updraft and downdraft motions that allow it to accumulate ice layers and eventually falls when its weight exceeds the updraft's ability to support it. The cells will track southeastward through the late afternoon and evening with the steering flow, which means the hail signature moves from west of Abilene southeastward toward the I-35 corridor and the western side of Dallas-Fort Worth during the early to mid-evening hours. The forecast operational note that has come out of the discussion is that as the discrete cells mature through the evening, they are likely to grow upscale into bowing structures, which is the term for organized lines of thunderstorms that form when individual cells merge and develop a coordinated outflow boundary that pushes them eastward as a unit. The bowing structures take the hail signature and combine it with a damaging wind signature, producing what the National Weather Service calls a mesoscale convective system, or MCS. The MCS that develops out of the west central Texas discrete cells tonight is forecast to push southeastward through the overnight hours, eventually reaching south central Texas and the cities of San Antonio, Corpus Christi, and Houston by the early morning hours of Wednesday. The overnight MCS will be the second wave of severe weather in Texas today, and it is the wave that is going to keep the alert ledger active across the southern plains through the early Wednesday morning hours. On the Ohio Valley and lower Great Lakes leg of the corridor, the storm mode is different. Up there, the synoptic environment is supportive of organized convection, but not strongly supportive of supercell organization. The shear is similar in magnitude but less optimally oriented relative to the boundary along which the storms develop. The instability is similar in magnitude but is being released through a different mesoscale forcing, which is the diurnal heating of the surface beneath a partially clear sky combined with the convergence along an outflow boundary that has been propagating eastward through the morning. The forecast call from the Storm Prediction Center is for scattered clusters of storms across the Ohio Valley and into western New York during the afternoon and early evening, producing damaging wind gusts as the primary threat. The hail threat on this leg is generally pocket change sized, meaning quarter to half dollar in diameter, with isolated cells capable of producing larger stones if the storm structure briefly organizes. The tornado threat across the entire corridor today is low, but it is not zero, and the locations where it is concentrated are worth noting. The operational forecast identifies central Texas, in the discrete supercell environment described above, as the one corridor where a brief spin-up tornado is plausible. The other corridor where an isolated tornado is possible is across the Lake Erie region of the lower Great Lakes, where the lake breeze convergence can occasionally enhance low-level rotation in a storm that otherwise would not produce one. A third potential corridor that may be added to subsequent Outlook updates is central Indiana, where the late afternoon storm development could organize sufficiently to support brief rotation. None of these corridors carry the high-end tornado threat that has characterized the spring outbreaks of the past several weeks. The day is not a tornado day in any meaningful sense. The damage today is going to come from wind and hail, with the wind component dominant in the east and the hail component dominant in the west. Through the morning hours, an elongated line of thunderstorms is already in place from western Illinois southwest into central Oklahoma. That line is producing damaging wind gusts of 40 to 60 miles per hour, mostly modest in scale and largely embedded within heavier rainfall that is masking the wind threat for most observers. The line will continue marching eastward through the late morning and early afternoon, weakening somewhat over the daylight hours but maintaining the damaging wind signature across the Ozarks and into western Kentucky and Tennessee. Around lunchtime, the line will stretch from Cape Girardeau, Missouri back into Dallas-Fort Worth, producing damaging wind gusts around 60 miles per hour near the Metroplex and pocket change hail along its leading edge. By 2 to 3 in the afternoon, the line will be marching across Arkansas, the Dallas-Fort Worth area, and the Texarkana region. The first discrete cells will begin firing west of Abilene around 3 in the afternoon, and that is when the hail signature begins. Through the mid-afternoon and early evening, additional storms develop across Michigan and Indiana, generally between 3 and 8 in the evening. These storms will be fairly isolated to scattered in nature, with the potential for large hail and possibly a brief tornado if any single storm can mature in the environment. The challenge for storm maturation across this region today is that there is too much potential convection in the same air mass. The storms compete with each other for the available instability. The result is that most storms remain disorganized and produce only modest threats, while occasionally a single dominant cell will develop into a more serious threat as the other storms in its vicinity collapse and donate their instability to it. This is a common pattern in late afternoon springtime severe weather across the Ohio Valley. By 4 to 5 in the afternoon, the storm coverage is high across the entire corridor. There will be storms near Detroit producing damaging wind gusts and possibly a brief tornado. There will be pop-up storms across central and northern Indiana trying to do the same. There will be a broken line across Indianapolis and western Kentucky producing gusty winds. There will be storms across Arkansas, Louisiana, and East Texas continuing to push the damaging wind signature from Little Rock and Jonesboro down to Lufkin. And the discrete cells over West Texas will be producing the hail signature, with the storms beginning to organize into the early evening MCS that will push southeastward through the night. Between 6 and 7 in the evening across the Ohio Valley, storm coverage near Fort Wayne and Indianapolis will be more scattered and at times numerous, producing the damaging wind threat as the primary concern with a low tornado risk. By 9 to 10 in the evening, most Ohio Valley storms will be weakening as the diurnal forcing diminishes, and the elevated mixed layer cap that has been suppressing convection across the warm sector through the afternoon re-establishes itself. The deep south severe corridor across Mississippi and central southern Louisiana will likewise weaken through the evening, with damaging winds up to 60 miles per hour, the only significant remaining concern. The overnight hours will be dominated by the South Texas MCS, with a line pushing through San Antonio, Corpus Christi, and Houston between approximately 2 and 6 in the morning Wednesday. What 90 million people are about to spend the evening living through is not a tornado outbreak. It is a continental severe weather pulse that is going to produce damaging winds in the Ohio Valley, giant hail in West Texas, and a sleepless night across South Texas as the late evening MCS pushes through. It is going to put pressure on the electrical grid as the wind damage produces scattered outages across multiple states simultaneously. It is going to put pressure on the emergency response system as the simultaneous severe weather events across multiple National Weather Service forecast areas stretch the agency's resources. And it is going to set up the second act of the story, which is what happens on Wednesday when the cold front passes through and the entire pattern begins to unwind. Part 4. The 25-degree crash. If today is the operational maximum of what this Rossby wave is producing, then tomorrow is the operational pivot, and Thursday is the operational collapse. The same wave that is producing today's heat dome and today's severe corridor is going to exit the stage across 48 hours, and when it goes, it takes the heat with it. The Baltimore-Washington office, in the discussion I quoted from earlier, calls the post-frontal cooling a 25 to 30-degree nosedive late this week. The Boston office describes Memorial Day weekend as cooler and unsettled, with confidence remaining low. The New York City office describes a much cooler air mass expected Thursday into the holiday weekend with chances of showers. The Mount Holly office describes the cold front bringing widespread showers and thunderstorms to the region Wednesday afternoon and evening, then much cooler temperatures by the end of this week. All of these offices, reading the same model guidance, are arriving at the same conclusion. The atmosphere is about to flip. The mechanism is a strong cold front being driven southeastward by the same deep upper-level trough that has been sitting over the western United States. The cold front is forecast to move through the mid-Atlantic Wednesday afternoon and evening, then continue across the southern New England coast by Wednesday night into early Thursday morning. The Storm Prediction Center's day, Setub convective outlook, places a marginal to slight risk severe weather threat across the Cumberland Plateau through the mid-Atlantic and into southern New England, Wednesday afternoon and evening, with damaging downburst winds the primary threat and isolated marginally severe hail also possible. The instability environment ahead of the front Wednesday afternoon, the discussion describes, includes 1,000 to 2,000 joules per kilogram of mixed layer convective available potential energy with minimal capping, supporting a gradual increase in thunderstorm coverage and intensity through the afternoon. The strongest vertical shear, the office notes, is to the north of the surface warm sector, which limits the potential for organized storm modes, but the well-mixed boundary layer of 1 to 1.5 kilometers depth is supportive of locally damaging downburst winds through the afternoon into early evening. The Wednesday severe threat, in short, is real, but not on the scale of today's. The cold front passage is going to produce strong to severe storms across the mid-Atlantic and into New England. But it is going to do so as an organised line of cells along the boundary rather than as a continental-scale severe corridor. The primary threats are damaging downburst winds and large hail. The tornado threat is low. The flood threat from training cells along the front is real but localised. The event will produce property damage and power outages and travel disruptions, but it will not produce the kind of multi-state severe weather signature that today is producing. What it will produce is the thermal collapse. Behind the front, the air mass that arrives is what the operational community calls Canadian air, which is the colder, drier air mass that originates over the boreal forests and tundra of central and eastern Canada. The Canadian air mass on the backside of a late May cold front is typically still cool, but the magnitude of the cooling depends on how cold the source region was and how quickly the front pushes through. In today's setup, the source region for the postfrontal air mass is a high latitude region that has not yet fully warmed for the season, and the trough that is driving the front is amplified enough that the postfrontal flow draws the cold air efficiently southward. The result is that the postfrontal afternoon highs across the mid-Atlantic and New England drop from the mid to upper 90s on Wednesday to the upper 60s and low 70s on Thursday and Friday. The drop is 25 to 30 degrees in 24 to 48 hours. Let me put that in human terms. A person who walks outside in Philadelphia on Wednesday afternoon at 3 in the afternoon is going to feel air that is somewhere in the high 90s. The same person who walks outside in Philadelphia on Friday afternoon at 3 in the afternoon is going to feel air that is somewhere in the high 60s. That is a 30-degree change in the variable that the human body uses to calibrate every behavioural decision about clothing, fluid intake, outdoor activity, and air conditioning use, within 48 hours, across one weather system. The body of the population that just spent 2 days struggling to cope with mid-May heat in an unacclimated state is now going to spend 2 days adjusting back to mid-May, normal in a different direction, with rain showers and clouds and the lingering humidity of a frontal passage as the transitional weather. The grid that just spent 2 days handling a late July demand profile is going to drop back to a late April demand profile. The peaking plants that came online for today and tomorrow are going to go back into reserve. The wholesale electricity prices that spiked are going to fall. The water utilities that were running at high load are going to fall back to normal. The emergency rooms that were absorbing heat-related cases are going to see those admissions taper off. The whole system, the grid and the water and the public health and the workforce, is going to reset across 48 hours. This is not a normal frontal passage. A normal late May cold front in the mid-Atlantic produces a 5 to 10 degree temperature drop and a noticeable but not extreme weather change. A 25 to 30 degree drop is in the upper tail of frontal passage magnitudes for the May calendar window. It is consistent with what the area forecast discussions are calling a high-amplitude wave configuration, in which the prefrontal heat departure is large in absolute terms, and the postfrontal Canadian air mass is a cooler than typical late May Canadian air mass, producing a larger than typical thermal contrast across the front, and the consequence of a 48-hour 30-degree swing layered on top of a body that just spent 2 days in unacclimated heat stress is medically significant. The cardiovascular system that just spent 48 hours adjusting to elevated demand for blood pumping to support skin cooling has to readjust to a lower demand state. The metabolic systems that just spent 48 hours running in heat stress mode have to recalibrate. For most of the population, this is annoying and uncomfortable but not dangerous. For the at-risk population, the elderly and the cardiovascular compromised and the renal compromised, the rapid reversal can be a stressor in its own right. The medical literature on rapid temperature transitions identifies a smaller but real secondary cardiovascular risk in the days following a significant heat event, especially when the post-event cooling is rapid. The grid risk in the post-event period is small but worth noting. The grid is designed to ramp up and ramp down with weather, but a 25 to 30 degree swing produces a rapid transition that can occasionally stress individual generation facilities that just ran hard for 48 hours and now need to be brought down. The risk of an unplanned outage at one of the peaking plants is elevated in the immediate post-event period, although the overall reliability of the regional transmission system is high enough that this is rarely a concern that propagates to the public. The fire weather risk in the post-event period is more nuanced. The dry hot air on the western side of the cold front and the residual heat on the eastern side Both leave behind ground conditions that are drier than they were before the event. The vegetation that just spent 2 days in heat stress, particularly the herbaceous fuels that respond rapidly to atmospheric moisture deficits, is drier behind the front than ahead of it. If the wind on the backside of the front is strong, which it sometimes is in a high-amplitude post-frontal regime, the fire weather conditions in the affected areas can briefly become elevated. The current forecast does not call for elevated fire weather in the mid-Atlantic behind this front, but the underlying vegetation drying is a real consequence of the heat event that will persist for some days afterward. Now, here is the part that is going to surprise most people who are watching today. After Wednesday's cold front passage and the 30-degree crash that follows, the synoptic environment does not produce a follow-on event. It does not produce a series of secondary fronts or a sustained active period of severe weather. It produces an extended quiet. The next significant organized severe weather window, as identified by the operational forecast community, does not arrive for approximately a week. The atmosphere produces today, produces Wednesday's cold front, produces the temperature crash, and then goes silent for the better part of 7 days. The next legitimate shot of significant organized severe weather is identified as approximately May 25th through May 28th. That is what the operational forecasters are telling each other right now. And that gap, that silence, is the second half of what we are talking about today, and it is the part that I want to spend the next several parts of this video unpacking. The atmosphere does not normally do this. The atmosphere normally produces an active period that lasts for several days, then a transitional period of a day or two, then another active period. The pattern of one outsized day followed by a week of quiet is not the normal forecast cycle. It is what the operational community calls a high-amplitude wave configuration that produces a compressed multi-hazard event and then exits, leaving behind an environment that is depleted of the synoptic-scale energy required for organized weather development. The wave that produced today is the wave that exits, and when it exits, there is no immediate replacement. That is the structural beat that today's story is built around. The maximum and the silence, the compressed pulse and the calibrated quiet. The Rossby wave that organized itself into an outsized event over the past several days peaked today and is about to take its energy with it as it exits to the east. What comes back to replace it is the question for next week, and the answer the operational forecasters are giving, when you read the long-range discussions, is that the replacement wave is not visible in the model guidance for the May 20th through 24th window. The model guidance shows quiet. It shows generally zonal flow, which is the operational term for a flat west-to-east pattern without significant wave amplification. It shows scattered weak shortwaves moving through, but nothing organized enough to produce a significant severe weather event. It shows the synoptic environment that the forecasters are describing as not very favorable for organized severe weather. That is the operational forecast. And the editorial question that the forecast raises is the one I am asking you to keep in your mind as we work through the rest of this video. Why does the atmosphere produce a 48-hour multi-hazard pulse and then go silent? What is the physical mechanism that produces an outsized event followed by a calibrated quiet? And what does the pattern tell us about what the same atmosphere is going to do in the coming weeks and months as the El Niño Southern Oscillation Index continues its slow drift from neutral into watch state territory and the synoptic environment becomes more energetically forced by the developing El Niño backdrop? The answers to those questions are in the next several parts. Let me start by unpacking the physics of how one wave produces two faces. Part 5. One wave, two faces. To understand why today is doing what it is doing, you have to understand what a Rossby wave is, and you have to understand it not as a piece of meteorological jargon, but as a physical object that has a shape, and a phase and an amplitude, and that does specific things to the air underneath it depending on how those properties are configured. A Rossby wave is a long, slow, large amplitude oscillation in the mid-latitude westerly flow of the atmosphere, named after the Swedish-American meteorologist Carl Gustaf Rossby, who in the 1930s worked out the physics that connects the rotation of the planet, the equator-to-pole temperature gradient, and the apparent meandering of the jet stream into a single mathematical framework. The waves exist because the planet rotates, and because the equator is warmer than the poles. The combination of the rotation and the temperature gradient sets up a circulation that, when you look at it on a global scale, organizes itself into a series of waves that propagate slowly eastward around the mid-latitudes, typically with 5 to 7 complete wavelengths around the entire hemisphere. When the waves are at low amplitude, the jet stream looks relatively flat on a map, running mostly west to east with shallow meanders. The weather underneath the low-amplitude wave pattern is generally fast-moving, with weather systems progressing eastward at 30 to 50 miles per hour and the typical weather cycle at any single location lasting a day or two before the next system arrives. When the waves are at high amplitude, the jet stream looks deeply meandering on a map, with deep troughs and tall ridges, and the weather underneath a high-amplitude pattern is generally slower moving, with weather systems progressing eastward more slowly and the typical weather cycle at a single location lasting 3 to 5 days or longer. The high-amplitude pattern is what produces persistent weather, the kind of pattern lock where the same location keeps getting the same weather day after day. What is happening today is a high-amplitude wave pattern at a specific phase. The deep trough is over the western United States. The strong ridge is over the southeastern United States and the western Atlantic. The wavelength between the trough axis and the ridge axis is roughly the distance from the Rockies to the Atlantic coast. The wave is doing exactly one thing to the air underneath it on the western side, and exactly one different thing to the air underneath it on the eastern side, and the two things are physically connected because they are produced by the same wave. On the western side, under the trough, the air is being lifted. The wave is producing rising motion. The rising motion cools the air as it descends, which causes any water vapor in the air to condense into clouds and precipitation. The trough is also producing the southward transport of cooler air from the north, which is why you've had cool weather across the Pacific Northwest and the Intermountain West for the past several days, and why you've had the late-season snowstorms in Wyoming and Colorado that we covered in yesterday's video. The cold front that is sagging across the plains today is the boundary between the cool air the trough is transporting southward and the warm air that the ridge is holding in place to the east. The severe weather today is happening along that boundary, in the warm sector, where the moist Gulf air collides with the encroaching cold front and the atmosphere becomes unstable and convex. On the eastern side, under the ridge, the air is being suppressed. The wave is producing sinking motion. The sinking motion warms the air as it descends, by the same dry adiabatic mechanism that I described earlier when I talked about the 850 millibar temperatures. The sinking air also dries out, because the warming reduces the relative humidity of any moisture that was in the air. The ridge is also producing the northward transport of warmer air from the south, which is why you have the Gulf and Atlantic origin of the warm sector that is currently sitting over the I-95 corridor. The heat dome today is happening because the ridge is doing exactly the thing a ridge does, which is to suppress vertical motion, warm the column, dry the air, and import warm air from the south. The combination produces the surface temperatures we're watching today. So now you understand the basic physics. Trough produces severe weather on its eastern flank. Ridge produces a heat dome on its center. Wave amplitude determines how persistent and how intense both signatures are. The two are physically connected because they are produced by the same wave at the same time. They are not coincidences. They are the two operational faces of one underlying configuration. The next thing to understand is why the wave is at this amplitude on this calendar position, and that is where the peer-reviewed literature gets interesting. There is a body of research in atmospheric science that has been building since the late 2010s, focused on the question of whether the frequency of high-amplitude wave configurations like today's has been changing over the past several decades, and if so, why? The most prominent name in this research is the German atmospheric scientist Kai Kornhuber, whose work first published in Nature Climate Change in 2020, and then updated in Nature Communications in 2023, identifies a particular class of high-amplitude wave called a wave number 5 to 7, quasi-resonant amplification event. The technical term is dense and academic. Let me unpack what it actually means. The number 5 to 7 refers to the number of full wavelengths the wave has around the hemisphere. A wave number 5 wave has 5 ridges and 5 troughs, going all the way around the planet at mid-latitudes. A wave number 7 wave has 7 of each. The quasi-resonant part of the name refers to the phenomenon in which the wave, instead of propagating eastward at its typical speed, gets stuck in place for an extended period. The atmosphere has a natural set of frequencies at which it likes to oscillate, and when an external forcing, like the temperature gradient between the warming Arctic and the still warm tropics, drives the atmosphere at a frequency close to one of those natural frequencies, the wave gets amplified and slowed. The result is that the same wave pattern, with the same ridge in the same place and the same trough in the same place, sits there for days or weeks instead of progressing eastward. When that happens during the summer months in the Northern Hemisphere, the consequence is that the same regions repeatedly get the same weather. The same ridge sits over the same continent and produces a sustained heat dome. The same trough sits over the same continent and produces sustained severe weather and flooding. And the same configuration produces the synchronization of extreme events across multiple geographic regions at the same time because the wave is global, not local. A wave number 5 amplification event produces simultaneous heat extremes across North America, Europe, and Central Asia, because the ridges of the wave number 5 wave all peak at the same time on their respective continents. Kornhuber and his collaborators found, in the 2020 paper, that during quasi-resonant wave number 5 and 7 events, the probability of concurrent heat extremes across multiple major breadbasket regions is enhanced by up to 20 times relative to non-resonant periods. The probability of regional crop loss, the paper found, is enhanced by an average of 4% globally and up to 11% regionally during these resonant amplification events. That is a substantial signal. The paper was the first to put precise statistical numbers on something that operational meteorologists had been observing for years, which is that the major heat events of the 2010s, the European heat dome of 2018 and 2019, the Pacific Northwest dome of 2021, the Texas dome of 2022, and the events that followed, all had a common signature in the upper level wave field that pointed to amplified resonance as the underlying physics. The 2023 follow-up paper in Nature Communications added a new finding that is operationally significant for what we are watching today. The current generation of climate models, the paper found, underestimates the observational frequency of synchronized concurrent extremes. In other words, the real atmosphere is producing more of these compressed multi-hazard events than the models predict, and the underprediction is statistically robust across multiple model families. The paper does not yet have a fully accepted physical explanation for why the models underestimate the frequency, but it suggests several candidate mechanisms, including the way the models represent the Arctic temperature anomaly, the way they represent ocean heat content in the North Atlantic, and the way they represent the soil-moisture coupling that we will get to in a later part of this video. The operational takeaway is that whatever is happening in the real atmosphere with respect to wave amplification frequency is happening faster than the models say it should. That is the literature context for what we are watching today. Today is operationally consistent with a quasi-resonant wave number 5 to 7 amplification event. The wave is high amplitude, the ridge is anchored, the trough is anchored, the timing is producing a compressed multi-hazard event, and the configuration is the kind that Kornhuber and colleagues have been describing as becoming more frequent than the models would predict. We covered the Kornhuber framework in detail in our video from yesterday and again in our video from May 16th, and I am not going to relitigate the full physics here, because if you have been watching this channel for the past several days, you have heard the framework explained. What is new today is that the framework that we have been describing as the explanation for the recent pattern is producing, on this specific day, the operational verification of what the framework predicts. The compressed multi-hazard event, the simultaneous heat and severe and flood signature across a continental scale, the synchronization of the two faces of the wave on the same day, is exactly what the literature describes as the expected operational fingerprint of the configuration. And the fact that today is happening on May 19th, on the calendar position where this kind of event is statistically least likely in the empirical record, is the part that the literature says is now happening more often than the models predict. So that is the why. The wave is high amplitude because the atmosphere is currently in a configuration that supports wave number 5 to 7 amplification. The amplification produces today's compressed multi-hazard event. The compression is happening earlier in the calendar season than the historical baseline says it should, and the underlying drivers, including the Arctic warming, the equator to pole temperature gradient changes, the ocean heat content anomalies, and the soil moisture coupling, are all candidates for why the frequency of these events appears to be increasing. Part 6. After the crash, the silence. Now we come to the part of the story that nobody is talking about yet, and it is the part that I think is most operationally interesting. After the Wednesday cold front passage and the 25 to 30 degree temperature crash that follows, the synoptic environment across the eastern United States does not produce another organized event. It goes quiet. The next significant organised severe weather window, according to the operational forecast community, does not arrive for approximately a week. The next legitimate shot at a comparable multi-hazard event is identified as approximately May 25th through May 28th. That is not a normal forecast cycle. A normal late May forecast cycle in the United States produces an active period of 3 to 5 days, then a transitional period of a day or two, then another active period. The pattern of one outsized day followed by a week of synoptic-scale silence is the pattern of an exhausted atmosphere, the kind of pattern that follows a quasi-resonant amplification event when the wave that produced the event exits the configuration, and the atmosphere has to spend several days reorganizing before it can produce another high-amplitude wave somewhere else. The physical mechanism behind the post-event quiet is something that the Han 2021 paper in Water Resources Research touches on, although the paper is more focused on the drought-related consequences of low-phase speed Rossby wave packets than on the post-event recovery. The basic physics is that a high-amplitude wave that gets stuck in place draws energy from the surrounding flow. The energy comes from the temperature gradient between the warm sector and the cold sector, and from the kinetic energy of the jet stream that the wave is sitting in. When the wave persists for days, it depletes the local energy reservoir. When the wave finally moves on or breaks down, the atmosphere it leaves behind is depleted of the synoptic-scale energy required for another high-amplitude wave to form quickly in the same region. The result is a quiet period that lasts until the surrounding flow reorganizes and a new energy gradient is built up, which typically takes several days to a week. The forecast for the May 20th through 24th window, when you read the Long-Range National Weather Service discussions, shows exactly the kind of quiet you would expect from a post-amplification depletion. The flow shifts from the high-amplitude wave configuration toward a more zonal pattern. The zonal pattern, which is the operational term for a flat west-to-east jet stream with shallow meanders, does not support strong surface frontal development. It does not support strong vertical motion. It does not support the kind of moisture transport that drives severe weather and flooding. The synoptic environment becomes, in the phrase the forecasters use, not very favourable for organised severe weather. That is the operational diagnosis. The atmosphere produces today, produces the Wednesday cold front, produces the temperature crash, and then enters a synoptically depleted state that persists for roughly a week. The next time the atmosphere produces an organised event is when the next high-amplitude wave reorganises, which is forecast for approximately May 25th through 28th, when a more significant troughing ejection over the Rockies is projected to set up the next configuration. What is interesting about this, editorially, is what the silence implies. The silence is not the absence of weather, it is the absence of organised weather. There will still be scattered showers and thunderstorms across the United States during the May 20th through 24th period. There will still be daily weather variability. The temperatures will still rise and fall with the diurnal cycle and the slow passage of weak shortwaves. But there will not be a multi-hazard pulse like today, and there will not be a severe weather outbreak, and there will not be a continental-scale frontal passage that drops temperatures by 30 degrees. The atmosphere will be, in a sense, breathing out for a week. And the operational consequence of that breath is that the next event, the one that arrives around the Memorial Day weekend, lands on an atmosphere that has had time to rebuild its energy reservoir. The May 25th through 28th window is significant for a few reasons. It is the Memorial Day weekend window for the United States, which means it is a window during which many millions of Americans are travelling, attending outdoor events, and otherwise in positions where weather disruption has unusually large social consequences. It is the start of the operational summer for the air travel industry, which means an organised severe weather event during that window has flight disruption consequences that ripple through the entire national air travel system. It is the window during which several major outdoor sporting events, including the Coca-Cola 600 at Charlotte Motor Speedway and the Indianapolis 500 at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, are scheduled, both of which are vulnerable to weather-related disruption. And it is the window during which the agricultural sector across the central United States is in the critical late planting and early vegetative growth stage for corn and soybeans, which means a hail and wind event during that window has crop damage consequences that are amplified relative to the same event a week earlier or later. The operational forecast community does not yet know what the May 25th through 28th event will produce. The model guidance at this range is too uncertain to make confident statements about specific severe weather threats. but the synoptic environment, the building of the next high-amplitude wave configuration, is something the forecasters are watching closely, because the configuration that arrives at the end of next week is likely to be the next operational verification of whether the recent run of high-amplitude amplification events is going to continue. Here is the part that I think is going to surprise the audience. The recent run of high-amplitude events has been continuous for the past several weeks. The mid-April outbreak that produced the EF4 tornado at Enid, Oklahoma, and the EF3 at Mineral Wells, Texas, was a high-amplitude event. The May 8th bicoastal heat dome was a high-amplitude event. The May 9th phase 2 inland migration was a high-amplitude event. The May 10th M5.7 flare from active region 4436, while space weather not surface weather, occurred against the same synoptic backdrop. The May 12th worst US drought signal was the cumulative downstream consequence of a sustained high-amplitude pattern that had been suppressing precipitation across the southwestern and southern United States for months. The May 13th multi-day severe weather sequence was a high-amplitude event. The May 16th fire weather corridor was a high-amplitude event. The May 18th convergent story, the simultaneous Wyoming blizzard, and East Coast heat dome rebuild on the same day was the most extreme high-amplitude event in the recent sequence. And today, May 19th, is the operational verification of the May 18th forecast and the highest magnitude individual event in the recent run. If the May 25th through 28th window produces another comparable event, then the operational pattern of the past several weeks is not a coincidence. It is a sustained high-amplitude regime that is producing event after event with brief synoptic-scale recoveries between them. The implication of a sustained regime, when you read the literature, is that the regime continues until something changes. The thing that could change it, on the timescale of weeks to months, is the ENSO state. The thing that could change it on the timescale of months to years is the longer-term climate forcing, including the Arctic warming and the ocean heat content changes that are reshaping the temperature gradient that the wave amplification depends on. Neither of those changes is going to happen between now and the end of May. So the operational expectation, when you ask the forecasters in private, is that the high-amplitude regime continues. The events that follow today are likely to be in the same general magnitude class as today. That is the second act question. After the maximum, after the crash, after the silence, what comes back? And the answer the operational community is giving is that the silence is temporary, the recovery is structural, and the next event is coming on schedule. The atmosphere is in a regime, and the regime is producing the events. Today is one of them. May 25th through 28th will likely be another, and the pattern continues. Now let me turn to the underlying ground conditions that are amplifying every one of these events, because the heat dome that 90 million people are sitting under right now is not just a heat dome produced by a wave, it is a heat dome produced by a wave sitting on top of a continent that is in the worst drought condition the modern instrumental record has ever recorded, and the combination of those two variables is what is producing the magnitude of the event we're watching. Part 7. The loaded ground underneath. The heat dome that 90 million people are sitting under right now is not happening on a normal piece of ground. It is happening on a piece of ground that is, by the formal measurement of the National Centers for Environmental Information, in the worst spring drought condition the modern instrumental record has ever recorded. We covered this in detail in our video from May 12th, the worst drought in the modern record video, and I am going to compress what we said in that video into a few paragraphs here, because the drought context matters for what today is producing, but I do not want to spend an hour relitigating what we already covered. The Palmer Drought Severity Index for March 2026, calculated against the 1900 to 2024 baseline that the National Centers for Environmental Information uses for the lower 48 United States, was -7.85. The April value was -7.56. Those are the most negative monthly values the index has produced since the Dust Bowl years of 1934. The cumulative January through March 2026 precipitation total for the lower 48 was the lowest on record going back to 1910. The January through April total was the second lowest. The southeast climate region, including the Atlantic coastal states, had its driest April in 40 years. 6 Atlantic coastal states had a top 10 driest April in the climate record. The United States Drought Monitor showed approximately 44% of the lower 48 in D2 severe drought, or worse as of late April, the largest such footprint since August 2012, The combined southeast region had 99% of its area in drought, 61.5% in D3 extreme or D4 exceptional. The Florida statewide drought intensity was the highest in the United States Drought Monitor record for that state. That is the ground that the heat dome is sitting on today. Dry ground. Ground that has been losing soil moisture for months. Ground that has been releasing moisture-related cooling through evapotranspiration at a rate that has progressively diminished as the available moisture has been depleted. The Morales paper, published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2019, identifies a soil-moisture-atmosphere coupling that operates exactly here. The paper finds that the likelihood of an extreme heat event is enhanced by approximately 30% when the underlying soil moisture is in the lower 10th percentile of the historical distribution. The mechanism is straightforward. Evapotranspiration cools the air. Dry soil cannot evapotranspire. When the soil is dry and the heat event begins, the evapotranspirative cooling that would normally moderate the heat is absent. The heat builds further, the further heat dries the soil further, the dried soil produces even less cooling, the feedback amplifies. Today's heat dome over the I-95 corridor is not a pure atmospheric heat event. It is an atmospheric heat event amplified by a soil moisture deficit signature that is in the upper tail of the historical distribution. The temperatures are higher than they would otherwise be, by some operationally significant fraction, because the ground underneath them is drier than the historical mid-May baseline. This is the dry soil amplification mechanism, and it is the mechanism that the Morales paper is built around, and it is the mechanism that the operational forecasters quietly acknowledge when they look at the temperature anomalies and know that the magnitude is larger than the synoptic forcing alone would predict. The Williams paper, published in Nature Climate Change in 2022, places the southwestern megadrought in a 1200-year context, using a tree ring network that extends back to the year 800 CE. The paper finds that the 20-year period from 2000 to 2021 was the driest 22-year stretch in the southwestern United States in at least 12 centuries. The paper attributes 42% of the soil moisture deficit during the megadrought period to anthropogenic forcing, meaning that without the human contribution to climate change, the drought would have been significantly less severe. The CU Boulder updated attribution work in 2025 extends the analysis through the most recent years and finds that the anthropogenic contribution has not decreased. If anything, the contribution to the cumulative soil moisture deficit has continued to grow as the warming continues. The combination of the Williams megadrought attribution and the Morales dry soil amplification mechanism produces a chain that runs from anthropogenic forcing to soil moisture to heat amplification, and the chain is operating right now under the I-95 corridor as we speak. The heat dome that 90 million people are sitting under is, in part, a downstream consequence of a megadrought that has been amplified by climate forcing and is now producing dry soil amplification of a synoptic-scale heat event in a region that is geographically separate from the megadrought core, but still affected by the broader continental drought signature. The flood side of today's story is the third face of the same wave, and it deserves a few paragraphs in this part of the video because the floods are a separate operational signature with a separate population and a separate consequence profile. As I mentioned in part 1, the National Weather Service is carrying 59 active flood warnings today across the central United States. The dominant signatures are the White River System in Indiana, the Grand River System in Missouri, and the Calcasieu and Vermilion River Systems in Louisiana. The Indianapolis Forecast Office has issued an extended flood warnings at Elliston, Newbury, Edwardsport and Petersburg, with some warnings extending through May 29th. The Kansas City Pleasant Hill office has issued an extended flood warnings at Gallatin, Sumner, Chillicothe, and Brunswick on the Grand River, with some extending through May 24th. The Lake Charles office has issued flood warnings on the Calcasieu and Vermilion rivers, extending through the weekend. The Houston-Galveston office, in its discussion issued at 6:30 this morning, describes a wet, muggy weather pattern continuing through the rest of the week across southeast Texas. Precipitable water values are near 2 inches, well above the 75th percentile of climatology. Multiple rounds of efficient rainfall-producing convection are expected, with some storms capable of producing 3 to 4 inches of rain per hour. Long-range guidance, the office writes, continues the wet trend into early next week, with day 1 through 7 quantitative precipitation forecast values of 5 to 7 inches becoming likely. The forecaster explicitly notes that subsequent floodwatch issuance for the Friday timeframe cannot be ruled out. The lower Yukon Valley in Alaska is also under a flood warning at Holy Cross, where the Yuki ice jam is released and is producing ongoing high water and flooding. Ice jam flooding in the Yukon system is an annual operational concern during the spring thaw, but the specific event today is producing flooding of rivers, creeks, streams, and low-lying flood-prone locations, with the warning in effect until 10 in the evening Alaska Daylight Time. The point of including the flood signature in this video, even briefly, is that the floods are the third face of the same Rossby wave configuration. The trough over the western United States is also producing the upper-level pattern that is supporting the moisture-laden flow across the southern plains and into the central United States. The moisture flow is the mechanism by which the floods are being fed. The same wave that's producing the eastern heat dome and the central severe corridor is producing the central and southern flood signature. One pattern, 3 faces. The flood story is the slowest moving of the 3, the one that develops over days and weeks rather than over a single afternoon, but it is the one that produces the largest cumulative property damage and the longest recovery timeline, and it is operational right now across multiple states. The combination of the heat, the severe weather, and the floods, all produced by the same wave configuration, sitting on top of the worst drought signature in the modern instrumental record, is what today is operationally. That is the full picture. The 3 operational signatures, the underlying drought amplification, the synoptic-scale wave producing all of them, and the population centres caught inside the various footprints. It is a continental scale event with multiple simultaneous expressions, and the editorial description that the operational community is using, the compressed multi-hazard pulse, is the right description. Part 8. The aerosol question. There is one more piece of the underlying physical context that needs to be addressed before we move on, because it is a real and contested area of the scientific literature, and the audience deserves an honest treatment of it. The piece is the question of whether the post-2020 period of accelerated warming over the North Atlantic and the Western Pacific, and the apparent uptick in the frequency of high-amplitude wave amplification events that has followed, is being driven in part by the removal of marine sulfate aerosols that followed the International Maritime Organization 2020 sulfur cap on shipping fuel. The story is this. On January 1st, 2020, the International Maritime Organization implemented a new global regulation, reducing the maximum sulfur content of marine fuel from 3.5% to half of 1%. The regulation was designed to reduce sulfur dioxide emissions from shipping for public health and acid rain reasons. It worked. Global sulfur dioxide emissions from shipping dropped by approximately 75 to 80% in the years following implementation. The unintended consequence, as some atmospheric scientists pointed out at the time, was that the sulfate aerosols that the shipping emissions had been producing in the marine atmosphere had been functioning as a planetary sunshade, reflecting incoming solar radiation back to space and providing a small but real cooling effect that partially masked the underlying greenhouse warming. When the aerosols were removed, the unmasking exposed the greenhouse warming. The result, according to one school of thought, was an acceleration in the rate of planetary warming, particularly over the North Atlantic and the Western Pacific, where the shipping density was highest and the aerosol forcing had been largest. The most prominent scientist arguing this position is James Hansen, the former NASA climate scientist whose Communications, Earth and Environment paper published in 2023 explicitly attributed an additional 0.05 degrees Celsius per decade of warming acceleration to the post-2020 aerosol unmasking. Hansen's paper has been highly cited and has been picked up by the broader climate research community as a candidate explanation for the temperature acceleration observed in 2023, 2024, and 2025. The acceleration is real and is documented in multiple independent temperature records, including the Copernicus, NASA GISS, and Hadley Center datasets. The counter-argument, published by Quaglia and Visiony in Atmospheric Chemistry and Physics in 2025, argues that the aerosol unmasking effect is real but smaller in magnitude than Hansen and colleagues claim. The Quaglia-Visiony paper places the post-2020 aerosol contribution to warming acceleration at a value closer to 0.01 to 0.02 degrees per decade, with the remainder of the observed acceleration attributable to other forcings, including the continued accumulation of greenhouse gases. The the natural climate variability associated with the recent El Niño development, and ocean heat content changes that are not solely attributable to the aerosol unmasking. The Quaglia-Vigini paper is not a dismissal of the Hansen hypothesis. It is a refinement that places the magnitude of the effect at the lower end of the plausible range. The honest scientific framing is that the aerosol unmasking hypothesis is being actively debated, that it is plausible, that the magnitude is contested, and that the evidence for some effect is reasonably robust, while the evidence for the full Hansen magnitude effect is contested. Where this matters for today's event is in the question of whether the apparent uptick in high-amplitude wave amplification events over the past several years is being driven in part by the aerosol unmasking. If the unmasking is producing additional warming over the North Atlantic in particular, the resulting changes to the temperature gradient between the Atlantic and the surrounding continents could be contributing to the conditions that favour quasi-resonant wave amplification. This is a chain of causation that the literature has not yet fully resolved. The Kornhuber papers identify the frequency increase. The Hansen paper identifies a candidate forcing mechanism. The connection between the two is plausible but not established. The restraint position is that today's event is not, in any meaningful direct sense, caused by the aerosol unmasking. The synoptic configuration that is producing today is the high-amplitude wave configuration, and the wave is being driven by the temperature gradient between the warm sector and the cold sector, and by the ocean heat content of the surrounding basins. The aerosol unmasking is one of several candidate explanations for why these high-amplitude events appear to be becoming more frequent. It is a contributing factor, possibly. It is not the cause of any individual event, including today's. The cause of today is the wave, and the wave is being amplified by a configuration of underlying drivers that include the soil moisture, the Arctic temperature anomaly, the ocean heat content, and possibly the aerosol unmasking, all operating together. This is the same kind of honest framing that I want to apply to the rest of the contributing factor questions that come up around today's event. No single mechanism is the explanation. Multiple reinforcing factors are operationally relevant. The wave is the proximate cause. The longer-term context includes the drought, the warming, the gradient changes, the aerosol question, and the ENSO trajectory, all interacting in ways that the literature is still actively working out. The audience deserves the honest version of that, not a clean single-cause story. The clean single-cause story is what the headlines are going to produce in the next 48 hours. The honest version is more complicated, and the honest version is what this channel is for. Part 9. What else is happening? For the next few minutes, I want to do something brief, which is to walk you through what is happening on the rest of the planet today, the operational signals across the other systems we cover on this channel. The point of this part is to give you the complete picture of where today sits in the larger context, and to underline how unusual today's atmospheric event is by showing you what is conspicuously not the story today. On the geological side, the United States Geological Survey has logged 84 earthquakes of magnitude 4.5 or greater globally in the past 7 days. The largest in the past 24 hours was a magnitude 5.7 at 27 kilometers depth, 51 kilometers south-southwest of Port Vila in Vanuatu. The USGS Green Alert indicates no significant casualty or economic loss is expected. A magnitude 4.8 aftershock, 13 kilometers south-southwest of Port Vila, followed approximately 3 hours later. Other notable seismic events include a magnitude 5.4 at 10 kilometers depth on the West Chile Rise, a magnitude 5.3 at 10 kilometers depth in the Bouvet Island region of the South Atlantic, a magnitude 5.2 at 10 kilometers depth on the Mid-Indian Ridge, a magnitude 5.2 at 10 kilometers depth in Guangxi Province in China, near the city of Liuzhou, and a magnitude 5.2 at 10 kilometers depth 36 kilometers south-southeast of Sirium in Burma. 2 paired deep-focus earthquakes south of the Fiji Islands occurred within 24 hours of each other at magnitudes 4.6, at depths of 589.8 kilometers and 564.7 kilometers respectively. The deep Fiji pairing is an unusual signature worth noting, but the overall seismic activity is in the normal range for a 1-week interval globally. On the volcanic side, 4 volcanoes in the United States carry elevated alert levels. Great Sitkin in the Aleutians is at watch, with an orange aviation color code. Kupreanof, Shishaldin, and Kilauea are all at advisory with yellow aviation color codes. The Yellowstone Volcano Observatory's most recent weekly report identifies 5 small hydrothermal explosions year to date at Black Diamond Pool in the Biscuit Basin thermal area, with the most recent on April 28th. The observatory notes that the webcam monitoring the pool is mounted on the remnant of the boardwalk that was destroyed by the July 23, 2024 explosion at the same pool. A 5-explosion year at a single hydrothermal feature is above the baseline for that feature, and it is the kind of pattern that the observatory continues to monitor, but it is not, today, anything that approaches the operational significance of what the atmosphere is doing. On the space weather side, the May 16th coronal mass ejection that produced the G2 geomagnetic storm last week is currently delivering only a glancing blow to Earth. The greatest observed 3-hour planetary K-index over the past 24 hours was 4, just below NOAA G1 storm level. The greatest expected 3-hour K-index through May 21st is forecast at 4.67, which is technically G1. Solar wind speed at 526 km per second this afternoon, declining from a weak shock that occurred shortly after 6 in the morning Coordinated Universal Time. The largest solar flare of the past 24 hours was a C2.1 from active region 4436 at 7:40 in the morning UTC. There are currently 4 numbered active regions on the visible solar disk, all decaying or stable except for region 4441, which sits at a moderate complexity level with a 25% C-class flare probability, a 5% M-class probability, and a 1% X-class probability over the next 24 hours. There are no Earth-directed coronal mass ejections in current coronagraph imagery. The space weather environment, in operational terms, is quiet through May 21st. On the space news side, the European Space Agency Solar Wind Magnetosphere-Ionosphere Link Explorer mission, known as SMILE, launched successfully at 3:52 this morning UTC on a Vega C rocket from the Guiana Space Center in French Guiana. SMILE is a joint mission between the European Space Agency and the Chinese Academy of Sciences, and it will for the first time image the global-scale interaction between the solar wind and Earth's magnetosphere, using a soft X-ray imager and an ultraviolet auroral imager. The mission's elliptical orbit will allow it to spend extended periods above the magnetospheric cusp regions, where the solar wind couples most directly to Earth's magnetic field. The data SMILE returns will fundamentally change how we monitor space weather and how we understand the geometry of the solar-terrestrial connection. Also, SpaceX is targeting May 21st at 22:30 UTC for the maiden flight of Starship version 3, also known as Flight 12. The launch will be the first from Orbital Launch Pad 2 at Starbase in Texas, and it will test a host of changes made to both the launch vehicle and the launch infrastructure as the company prepares to support the Artemis 3 mission in 2027. Flight 12 is not a particularly high-profile mission in the broader space launch calendar, but it is operationally significant for the long-term arc of human exploration that SpaceX is pursuing, and the National Aeronautics and Space Administration today opened a new citizen science project called Shock Detectives, which invites volunteers to help analyze more than 10 years of magnetospheric shock data collected by the Magnetospheric Multiscale mission. The MMS mission has collected more data on the solar terrestrial shock regions than any single team of scientists can analyze on its own, and the project distributes the work to the public. On the tropical side, the National Hurricane Center forecasts no tropical cyclone formation in the Atlantic, Eastern Pacific or Central Pacific basins during the next 7 days. The forecast for tropical inactivity, given the warming ENSO trajectory and the Atlantic Main Development Region temperature signature, is itself a quiet that is doing meaningful work in the larger story. The Atlantic Basin is warm. The East Pacific Basin is warm. The conditions that historically produce early-season tropical activity are partially in place. The absence of activity, in this configuration, is not a guarantee that activity will not develop quickly when the seasonal calendar advances into June and July. It is a quiet that, like the one I described earlier for the synoptic pattern, is the kind of quiet that may not last. The closest asteroid approach in the next 7 days is asteroid 2026 KF, which passes at 1.71 lunar distances, approximately 657,000 kilometers, on May 22nd at 1:15 UTC. The asteroid has an absolute magnitude of 26.1 and a relative velocity of 14.06 km per second. No objects pass inside 1 lunar distance during the forecast window. We covered the planetary defense gap and the detection capability question in our video from yesterday, the asteroid investigative variant video on the sunward blind spot, and I am not going to relitigate that here. The point of including the asteroid signature today is to confirm that there is nothing operationally unusual on the close approach side that competes with the atmospheric story. So that is everything else. The geological signature is normal. The volcanic signature includes the ongoing Black Diamond Pool monitoring, but nothing acute. The space weather signature is quiet. The space news signature includes the SMILE launch and the Starship Flight 12 preparation. The tropical signature is quiet. The asteroid signature is normal. On a day when any of those signatures would normally lead a Sky Lab brief, today they all sit underneath the atmospheric event, because the atmospheric event is the story. The absence of competing leads is itself, as I said earlier, the strongest evidence of how unusual today is. Part 10. What the audience will hear about this week. Let me spend the next part of this video pulling back from the data and showing you what the audience, the broader public, is going to hear about today's event over the next several days. The framing that today receives in the broader media environment matters because the framing shapes what people think happened, and the framing also shapes what people think the event implies for next week and next month and next year. The framing that today is going to receive in the broadcast meteorology community, on the major networks and on the cable channels, is going to be a straightforward description of the severe weather corridor and the heat dome as two separate weather stories. The severe weather coverage will focus on the Texas hail signature and the Ohio Valley wind signature, with a tornado tracker graphic and a few warning crawls and a quick update on power outages by the end of the evening newscast. The heat dome coverage will focus on the I-95 corridor records, with a graphic showing the cities that broke or tied their daily highs and a brief mention of the Wednesday cold front passage that will end the heat. The two stories will be presented as adjacent items on the same broadcast, but they will not be presented as the two faces of one wave. The synoptic-scale connection, the underlying physics that ties them together, is rarely something that the broadcast format has room for. The broadcasts have to move on to the next story. The framing that today is going to receive on social media is going to be different. Social media is going to compress today into a sequence of dramatic single-frame images and short video clips. The images will include radar loops of the severe corridor, surface observation maps showing the simultaneous temperature extremes, photographs of damaged property in West Texas where the giant hail hit, and time-lapse video of the cold front passage on Wednesday. The framing on social media will lean heavily on the word convergence. You will see posts arguing that today proves something is wrong, that the atmosphere has crossed a threshold, that the configuration is unprecedented, that the timing is suspicious. Some of those posts will be made in good faith by people who are correctly noticing that today is unusual. Some of them will be made in bad faith by people who are trying to attach an agenda to the event. The framing that today is going to receive in the climate attribution community is going to be a methodologically careful analysis that places today's event in the context of the changing climate baseline. The World Weather Attribution Group, the rapid attribution team that has produced post-event analyses for many of the major heat events of the past several years, will likely produce a quick look analysis within a few weeks. The quick look analysis will probably find that today's event was made more likely and more severe by human-caused climate change. The magnitude of the attribution will probably be in the range that the literature has produced for other recent heat events, which is to say a factor of 2 to 10 increase in the probability of an event of this magnitude in the current climate compared to the pre-industrial climate. The attribution analysis will not by itself resolve any of the open scientific questions about the wave amplification frequency, or the soil moisture coupling, or the aerosol unmasking. It will simply place today's event in the broader frame of a climate that is producing these events more often than the pre-industrial climate would have. The framing that today is going to receive in the political and policy environment is going to depend on the news cycle. If there are competing stories, today's event will get a day or two of coverage and then fade. If there are no competing stories, today's event may get a week of coverage that extends through the Wednesday cold front passage and the temperature crash, with the crash itself producing a second wave of coverage as the story shifts from heat to whiplash. The political coverage will probably not engage with the underlying physics. It will engage with the policy implications, including the energy grid stress, the public health response, and the infrastructure investment questions that the cumulative pattern of recent extreme events has been raising. The framing that today is going to receive in the broader public the framing that 90 million Americans inside the various footprints today are going to remember in a week, is going to depend on what happens in the post-event period. If the May 25th through 28th window produces another comparable event, the audience will remember today as the first of a sequence. If the window produces only modest weather, the audience will remember today as a single dramatic day. The persistence of the memory and the framing that crystallizes around it depends on what comes next. The framing that I want to offer you in this video, the framing that the channel exists to provide, is the synoptic-scale framing that the broadcasts do not have room for. Today is not two weather stories. Today is one weather event with multiple operational phases. The driver is a high-amplitude Rossby wave that is part of a longer run of high-amplitude wave configurations that have been organizing themselves across the past several weeks. The underlying physical context includes the worst drought signature in the modern instrumental record, a warming North Atlantic that may be partially the consequence of aerosol unmasking, a soil moisture configuration that is amplifying the heat side of the wave, and an ENSO state that is in the process of transitioning from neutral toward El Niño. The combination of all of these contributing factors is producing a regime in which the atmosphere is more capable of compressed multi-hazard events than the historical baseline would have predicted, and the regime is likely to continue producing events of comparable magnitude through the next several months at least. Today is a calibration event. Today is the atmosphere telling you what it is capable of producing at the May 19th, 2026 position. The next event, whether it comes in the May 25th through 28th window or later, will tell you whether the regime continues. And the events that come over the summer and fall, when the ENSO transition has progressed further and the soil moisture deficit has had more time to amplify or partially recover depending on what the rains do, will tell you what the regime is becoming. This is the part where I want to address something directly. The audience for this channel asks me, more than any other single question, whether what they are seeing in the daily weather is the new normal or whether it is a temporary anomaly. The honest answer is that the science is not yet at the point where it can produce a confident decadal forecast for the frequency of these compressed multi-hazard events. The Kornhuber papers identify a frequency increase. The Hansen aerosol hypothesis identifies a candidate mechanism. The Williams mega-drought attribution identifies a baseline shift in the soil moisture conditions. The ENSO trajectory is moving in a direction that historically supports more extreme events. The combination of these signals points toward a higher frequency future. But the science is not yet at the point where it can tell you whether today is the new average, or whether today is the upper tail of a distribution that has shifted upward, but not as far as today's event suggests. What I can tell you, with operational confidence, is that today is happening, today is unusual, and today is the kind of event that the literature has been describing as becoming more frequent. That is the honest framing. The audience that wants a definitive answer is going to be disappointed, because the science does not yet have one. The audience that wants an honest answer, the audience that wants the data and the context and the open questions presented as open questions, is the audience this channel is built for. Part 11. What people will say caused it. This is the part where I want to address the alternative explanations that are going to circulate in the next several days, because the channel's audience knows that I prefer to engage with these explanations directly rather than dismiss them. The explanations that are going to circulate fall into 4 general categories, and I want to walk through each one with the operational physics, so you have the actual answer when you encounter the claim somewhere. The first explanation that is going to circulate is the high-frequency active auroral research program theory. The claim is that the United States government, through the HAARP facility in Gacona, Alaska, is heating the ionosphere with high-power radio waves in order to produce or amplify weather events at the surface. The HAARP facility exists. The facility operates at approximately 3.6 megawatts of transmitter power, focused into the high-frequency radio band, and it produces ionospheric heating effects that are measurable using ionosondes and incoherent scatter radars. The facility is used for ionospheric research and is operated by the University of Alaska Fairbanks. The facility is real, it is documented, and the experiments it conducts are published in the peer-reviewed atmospheric science literature. The arithmetic problem with the HAARP weather control claim is the energy budget, a continental-scale Rossby wave configuration of the kind that is driving today's compressed multi-hazard event involves the daily transport and reorganization of approximately 10 to the 25th joules of energy. That is one followed by 25 zeros, expressed in joules. The Harrop facility, at 3.6 megawatts running continuously for a full day, would output approximately 3.1 times 10 to the 11th joules per day. The ratio of the energy required to drive the Rossby wave to the energy that HARP can produce is approximately 10 to the 14th, which is 100 trillion to 1. The Yuan paper, published in Atmospheric Chemistry and Physics in 2024, lays out this arithmetic in detail and provides the calculation for the audience to verify themselves. The physics does not support the claim. HARP could be running continuously at peak output for 100 trillion days, and it would not produce the energy required to drive a single day of today's configuration. The mismatch is not subtle. It is 17 orders of magnitude. The second explanation that is going to circulate is the cloud seeding theory. The claim is that cloud seeding operations, either by government agencies or by private contractors, are producing or amplifying the precipitation or the lack of precipitation associated with today's event. Cloud seeding is real. The technique is operationally used in many parts of the world, including the western United States, where various state and private programs seed winter snowstorms over watersheds to increase snowpack accumulation. The technique works by introducing condensation nuclei, typically silver iodide, into existing clouds, which slightly increases the precipitation efficiency of those clouds. The operational enhancement from cloud seeding is approximately 5 to 15% additional precipitation from clouds that were already producing precipitation. The technique only works on existing clouds. It cannot create clouds where no clouds exist, and it cannot create the synoptic-scale patterns that produce the clouds in the first place. The geographic scale at which cloud seeding operates is local to regional. It does not produce continental-scale patterns. The mechanism mismatch is straightforward. Today's continental signature is being produced by a wave number 5 to 7 configuration that no cloud seeding operation in the world has the technical capability to influence. The third explanation that is going to circulate is the chemtrails theory. The claim is that aircraft contrails contain aerosols deliberately released to modify weather patterns. The aviation industry produces aerosol emissions, primarily from jet engine combustion, and those emissions do have small climate impacts that are documented in the peer-reviewed literature. The total mass of aerosol emitted by global commercial aviation is, however, several orders of magnitude smaller than the mass that would be required to produce a continental-scale weather pattern. The geographic distribution of aviation traffic does not match the geographic footprint of today's anomaly. The mass-budget mismatch and the geographic mismatch together rule out the chemtrails theory as a forcing mechanism for events of today's scale. This is operationally distinct from the aerosol unmasking hypothesis I discussed earlier. The aerosol unmasking is about the removal of marine sulfate aerosols at planetary scale through international maritime regulation, not about aviation deployment. The two are different mechanisms operating at different scales through different pathways. The fourth explanation that is going to circulate is the solar-driven theory. The claim is that solar activity, including the May 16th coronal mass ejection that produced the recent geomagnetic storm and any flares from the currently active regions, is driving the surface atmospheric pattern. The Marchitelli paper, published in Scientific Reports in 2020, identifies a weak statistical correlation between solar variability and seismic event timing, but the paper does not extend the argument to synoptic-scale atmospheric forcing. The Mizuno-Kao-Umino preprint from 2026 expands on similar correlations. The energy coupling pathway from solar variability to the surface troposphere is well characterized in the peer-reviewed literature, and it is operationally too weak to produce the kind of continental signature we are watching today. The May 16th coronal mass ejection that is currently delivering a glancing blow has approximately zero direct relevance to today's heat dome or severe outbreak. The space weather story and the surface weather story today are independent. The general framing that I want to leave you with, when you encounter these claims, is that today is the operational verification of a pattern that has been visible in the forecast models for a week, that the contributing physics is well understood at the synoptic and mesoscale level, and that the story is interesting because the pattern is unusual, not because the mechanism is mysterious. The mechanism is a high-amplitude Rossby wave amplified by a configuration of underlying drivers that includes the soil moisture, the temperature gradient, the ocean heat content, and possibly the aerosol unmasking. The mechanism is not mysterious. The mechanism is in the literature. The mechanism is in the forecaster discussions. The mechanism is in the data. What is interesting and worth talking about is that the mechanism is now producing events at a frequency that the historical baseline did not predict, and the underlying drivers are pointed in a direction that suggests the frequency will continue to increase. That is the real story. The alternative explanations are distractions from it. Part 12. The calibration event. I want to close this video the way I started it, with the central question that today is asking. If the May 19th, 2026 atmospheric configuration is what the eastern third of the United States looks like when the El Niño Southern Oscillation Index is still officially neutral, what does the same configuration look like 6 months later when the Climate Prediction Center is forecasting a 61% probability of El Niño development and approximately 1 in 3 odds of a strong or stronger event by the 2026 to 2027 winter peak? That is the question. And the answer the literature is hinting at is the answer this video has been building toward across the past hour and a half. Today is the maximum operational expression of what a neutral but warming May atmosphere is capable of producing. The system that produced today exits the operational stage on Wednesday and remains off stage for approximately 1 week. When it returns, the ENSO backdrop will have shifted further. The audience watching this video is watching a calibration event. The atmosphere is showing you what it can do at the May 19th, 2026 position, what it does at the September 19th, 2026 position, or the December 19th, 2026 position is the question that follows. The recent history of the Oceanic Niño Index, the standard NOAA measurement of the El Niño Southern Oscillation state, tells you exactly where we are on the trajectory. The September-October-November 2025 season was negative 0.51. The October-November-December season was negative 0.55. The November-December-January season was negative 0.54. The December-January-February season was negative 0.37. The January-February-March season was negative 0.15. The February-March-April season, the most recent calculation, is positive 0.11. The index has crossed from negative La Niña territory into positive neutral trending El Niño territory in 6 months. The trend is warming. The slope of the warming is significant. The Climate Prediction Center has issued an El Niño Watch as of May 2026. The operational forecast probability of El Niño development by the May-June-July window is approximately 61%. The probability of a strong or stronger event by the December-January-February 2026 to 2027 peak is approximately 1 in 3. If the strong tier El Niño develops, the historical analog set includes the 1877 to 1878 super event that produced the global famine and the death toll of 50 million people that we covered in detail in our video from May 15th, the Super El Niño Implications video. I covered the food system synchronization thesis in that video, and I will not relitigate it here. The relevant point for today is that the underlying climate trajectory we are on is one in which the atmosphere has progressively more energy to work with in the coming months. The wave amplification mechanism that produced today is going to have more energy to draw on. The soil-moisture coupling that amplified today's heat dome is, depending on what the rains do over the next 2 months, either going to slightly recover or going to deepen further. The temperature gradient that drives the wave is going to shift as the equatorial Pacific warms and the tropical to mid-latitude differential changes. And the events that the atmosphere produces over the summer and fall of 2026 are going to be drawn from a distribution that is shifted by some operationally significant amount toward higher magnitudes. I cannot tell you, with confidence, how much higher. The literature does not yet have a confident decadal projection for the frequency of compressed multi-hazard events of today's class. The Kornhuber papers identify a frequency increase. The ENSO transition adds a forcing increase. The drought baseline adds an amplification increase. The aerosol unmasking, if Hansen is right, adds another increase. The combination produces a direction, but not a magnitude. The honest scientific answer is that we are on a trajectory toward more frequent events of today's class, and the trajectory is steepening, but we cannot tell you whether the next event of today's magnitude arrives in 3 weeks or 3 months or 3 years. What we can tell you is that the next event is coming. The atmosphere has produced one of these in the past week. It produced one yesterday with the convergence story, the simultaneous Wyoming blizzard, and the East Coast heat dome rebuild. It produced one today with the 90 million people, and the heat dome and the severe corridor and the Wednesday cold front. The operational forecast community is identifying the next significant organised severe weather window as approximately May 25th through May 28th. If that window verifies, the regime is sustained. If it does not verify, the regime is in transition. Either way, the trajectory of the climate is on points toward more of these. The question is not whether. The question is when and how often and how compressed. That is what today is. Today is one calibration point in a series. The atmosphere has shown you, on May 19th, 2026, what it can produce. It has shown you a Texas-to-Vermont severe corridor with 90 million people inside it. It has shown you an I-95 heat dome with another tens of millions of people inside that. It has shown you the simultaneity of the two faces. It has shown you the cold front whiplash that will follow within 48 hours. It has shown you the 7-day synoptic silence that will follow the whiplash. It has shown you the verification of a pattern that the literature has been describing as becoming more frequent. And it has shown you the calibration baseline against which the events of the coming months will be measured. If you are inside the heat dome footprint right now, hydrate, stay cool, check on the elderly and the medically vulnerable in your life, and remember that the body of an unacclimated population responds to mid-May 98 degrees differently than it responds to mid-August 98 degrees. If you are inside the severe weather corridor, monitor your local National Weather Service forecast office for the latest watches and warnings, and if you are in the Central Texas hail corridor, get your vehicle under cover before sunset. If you are inside the Central United States flood corridor, monitor the river stage forecast for the watersheds that affect your area. And if you are in Southeast Texas, where the Houston office is forecasting 5 to 7 inches of additional rainfall over the next week, be prepared for the possibility of flood watches becoming flood warnings as the watersheds saturate. And if you are anywhere in the country, watching this video and trying to make sense of why the weather seems to be doing things it did not used to do, take what you have learned today and carry it forward into the next event. The next event is coming. The pattern is real. The literature is converging on the explanation. The atmosphere is calibrated, and the next thing it produces is going to be drawn from a distribution that today has just shown you the upper tail of. The wave that produced today exits to the east on Wednesday. The temperature drops by 25 to 30 degrees by Friday. The atmosphere goes quiet for a week, and then, somewhere in the last week of May, the next wave begins to organise. The forecasters will tell you when it arrives. The audience for this channel will be ready, because the audience for this channel has just spent 90 minutes thinking carefully about what today actually was. The audience for this channel is calibrated too, and the next time the atmosphere does something like today, you will recognise it, and you will know what to ask and you will know what to watch. That is what today was. Thank you for watching. Stay safe through the rest of the week, and I will see you in the next video.